Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to um, do a brief recap of everything that we have done so far because from tomorrow you've got your CIA first starting. So I thought instead of beginning a new topic today, we'll just go through some of the topics that we have already done. So, starting from literary theorizing from Aristotle to F.R. Lewis, this is quite essential for us to understand so as to form a basis for understanding the contemporary theories. All right, contemporary theories would begin from somewhere around structuralism, post structuralism, new criticism. All of these would belong to come under the contemporary theories. Even though they are not so contemporary, it is, well, anyway. So, we saw a little bit about Aristotle, Philip Sidney, Samuel Johnson, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Eliot, and Keats, and some of the Victorian critics with Matthew Arnold, and after him, F.R. Lewis, the three, the great three, or whatever you call it, the famous three, F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards, and Empson. So we also understood what liberal humanism was in practice. Uh, so coming back to Aristotle, some of the key ideas that you need to remember in each writer is their one specific critical writing that formed the grounding for basis for further criticism, and you cannot negate Aristotle here at all, and even before him, Plato. So Aristotle wrote this work called Poetics, which discuss the nature of literature, and in various strategies or various sections, he discussed the importance of each writing, each form of poetry. All right, and also he discussed how plays are supposed to be made, their structure, the nature, the function of poetry, the function of drama, and how the reader or the audience is affected by these, what the nature of the hero should be, what kind of characters should be included, what time frame should it have to, what the time limit it should encompass. All of it he discussed in Poetics. So you need to remember Aristotle mainly because of his Poetics. All right, then we saw Sidney's Apology for Poetry. Please remember this. Why he wrote mainly? Because he was attacked. Especially, he was made a special mention of. It was dedicated to him by this person called Stephen Gosson, who wrote this work called The School of Abuse. Okay, please don't forget that. Because of that one particular attack, he had to defend. Sidney thought that he had to defend himself and thereby defend poetry, even though he did not explicitly mention Stephen Gosson anywhere. He brings on like those four charges. He mentions those four charges laid down upon poetry as to how poetry is concerned as a mother of all lies, how the nature of poetry is corrupt and it corrupts people, and how Plato himself did not want any poets in his ideal commonwealth. All of it he talked about, and he defends poetry in each sense. He says how poetry is necessary for moral vigor, how poetry is not the mother of all lies because it is not supposed to represent reality, it has its own reality. And he also spoke about how men are the ones that are abusing poetry, not poetry is abusing men. All of these he spoke. And also he makes mention of only classical writers, mainly classical writers, some of Italian writers. So he makes special reference of Ovid and Horace and other writers as well. Please bear that in mention. I've mentioned here only two. So this dossier delictando is sometimes mistakenly thought to be coming from Sidney, whereas it is actually Ovid's term. Okay, Ovid intended this term to mean to teach by delighting, which Sidney used and popularized. And Horace's definition of poetry as in a speaking picture to teach and delight. See, I want you to remember what each critic thought the function of writing or poetry was. Okay, because that would be essential for you to remember at some point. So then we saw Samuel Johnson in 18th century. There were other writers as well, but since Barry jumps to Samuel Johnson directly, we too do. His work, Lives of the Poets and Preface to Shakespeare, started off the trend of making specific criticism of particular writers, which was not the case earlier, because this is, see, apology for poetry is quite general. So this started off the new trend. Then Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads we saw as something, again, a general observation on what the nature of poetry should be, the language of poetry should be, or the content of, as in the situation that is depicted in a poetry should be. All right. So we saw Wordsworth and his stress on using language of real men. So this is something that he mainly did with his friend Coleridge, his one-time friend Coleridge. Later, we see Coleridge digressing away from Wordsworth, and he wrote this collection of essays called Biographia Literaria, which holds radically different views of poetry as compared to Wordsworth. And he believed that language is mainly entertaining because of its fictive qualities, which Wordsworth tried to compromise. So, if there is no fancy, if there is no imagination, that language would be devoid of any fictive qualities, as proposed by Wordsworth. And moreover, he accuses Wordsworth of defying his own rules. Then we saw Shelley's defense of poetry, how he anticipated certain concepts that came almost half a decade later. Okay, half a century later. So he anticipated the concept of defamiliarization, wherein you get to see through poetry something that you have been seeing every day with new eyes. New eyes in the sense you are defamiliarized of all those things that you that are familiar to you, and you get a new vision for those things, right? And also he anticipated Freudian concept of conscious and unconscious, wherein he feels that the genius mind, the mind itself, feels the power within, right? Then this power, it stays only for a transitory time. It stays only for a few moments, after which it fades. So there is an echo of conscious and the unconscious, where ideas appear in the unconscious and the conscious seems to grasp it, but somehow it fades immediately. And only a true genius, would be able to tap into it, harness that power, and use it to create poetry. Then we saw Eliot's tradition and individual talent, which stressed upon the need to stick on to the tradition and to acknowledge tradition for your genius. For whatever you are doing, whatever you've learned, it is because whatever you're creating is because you have a certain tradition behind you. So an individual talent cannot exist without the tradition, at least that's his belief. And some of his important terms is in dissociation of sensibility, objective correlative, and there was this also notion of impersonality. All of this we saw. I request you to please go through these once again. Okay. And then we saw there were other terminologies as well, which I haven't mentioned or included here. So we saw John Keats. How Keats did not write formal literary theory, but his criticism is mainly dependent on some of the letters he wrote to his brothers and some of his friends. So he too seems to have anticipated the idea of the conscious and the unconscious, which was proposed later on by Freud. So we see this one particular term which became quite popular later on after his death, the negative capability. Negative capability would be where you are okay with whatever mysteries that this world has to offer, or whatever mysteries or uncertainties or doubts that any art has to offer, without the irritable reaching after fact and reason. So this idea of negative capability, which was later on understood as suspension of disbelief, this is something that we all need to possess to some degree to appreciate literature. Then just a few names and some terms that they were known for. George Eliot was known for her classical and continental writers with philosophical issues. This is something that she focused upon, whereas Matthew Arnold brought in this touchstone method to assess the quality of a text. And Henry James' novel Realism, he invented this idea of realism, or rather popularized the idea of realism in his novel. And John Ruskin coined this term pathetic fallacy, wherein the nature seems to be in tandem with whatever the protagonist is going through. And then Walter Pater, his impressions, or individual subjective impressions are noted for. Then we saw Matthew Arnold, especially his function of criticism at the present time and the study of poetry. So these two main works, he wrote plenty of criticism, but these two seem to be more popular than the others, these two essays. So he believed, he understood literature to be a possible replacement for religion, and he also understood that the critic's job. I mean, he was I think he was the first one to tell you what the role of a critic is. So for him, a critic is someone who shows you what is best. Okay, the best that is known, all right, that has been known and thought in the world. Then he understood the idea of disinterestedness in a critic. So a critic has to be disinterested in the sense he should not hold any bias or prejudice against anyone. And also, he invented this idea of touchstone, wherein you always have in mind lines and expressions of the great masters and apply them as a touchstone to other poetry. And yes, he also made this personal estimate or the real estimate with historic estimate, right? And then we saw F.R. Lewis, Revaluation, the Great Tradition, Scrutiny. I mean, these are journals, basically, Scrutiny and Revaluation. So in his work, he basically wanted to not go for any abstract thought, okay, and he believed that it was useless to coin a special vocabulary to describe a content of literary content or literary idea. Okay, so he used very simple language, layman's terms, and his was a kind of combination of Johnson's moralism and Arnold's social vision. Then we saw I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards was the pioneer of the textualized approach to literature, and he was the one who first started off giving unannotated, anonymous poems to analyze to form a true judgment of the work rather than give a background and ask people to analyze it. Then William Emerson's Seven Types of Ambiguity, which became quite popular and are still popular, mainly because so he spoke of linguistic indeterminacy in language, how language itself is a slippery medium and how it could explode into plenty of meanings, and the unreliability of language as a medium. Then we saw a little how liberal humanism and theory seem to counteract with each other with very positive results, obviously. Then what liberal humanism in practice looked like to elucidate the point, we saw the Oval Portrait written by Edgar Allan Poe, and we saw the Leavisite approach of conflicting values between art and life. So I believe you remember all of it. So the main idea is to approach it from a moral perspective, approach the text from a moral perspective. Whereas the same text is seen once again in structuralism, wherein you approach the text from a structuralist perspective. So the moral point takes a back seat, right, in structuralism. So liberal humanism is mostly concerned with the readiness of the art to subject itself to moral purpose. All right. So the two things that stand out in this approach is the reading is driven by moral convictions rather than systematic approach to literary criticism. It champions life. It passes matters of form, structure, genre, etc. It bypasses all of these. Then structure, symbol, design, etc. are secondary. Okay. Then we come to the recurrent ideas in critical theory. Some of the basic ideas, we've got some 10 ideas here. Basic givens of our existence, we understand that the basic givens of our existence are fluid and unstable rather than fixed and reliable. So it is basically contingent categories rather than absolutes are formed. Then we understand that all thinking and investigation is affected and determined by prior ideological commitment. We are, we are preconditioned to understand everything. We understand text in our own way. Way in the sense, in the way our minds are conditioned before going into the text. So what I glean from a text would be very, very different from what you glean from it because of the kind of the differences, a difference in upbringing of each of one of us, how we've been culturally or even at environmentally conditioned. So hence the risk of relativism, everything is understood as relative. Even if we deny the influence of presuppositions, we are misleadingly presenting our theoretical positioning as common sense and absolute. So there is no absolute, there is no common sense, because everything is because of how they are, relative. Everything could be understood only in relation to one another. Then three, language itself conditions, limits, and predetermines what we see. So see, all of these ideas is what forms the basis for further contemporary theories. Okay, we are not talking about liberal humanism here, which is very, very humanistic in approach. We are talking about the general idea, or the general foundational understanding of all theory, and all contemporary theories. So language itself conditions, limits, and determines what we see. This is something that both structuralism and post-structuralism are very into, that language creates reality, or conditions and limits and predetermines what we see. So everything is a linguistic and textual construct. Whatever you see is linguistic. Whatever you see language, you see the world only through language, right? When you look at something, immediately a word appears in your head. Okay, not the written word, but some word, something that comes to your mind immediately. So you can understand things only through language. Now, language doesn't record reality, it shapes and recreates it. Whole of our universe is textual, meaning is jointly constructed by the reader and the writer. The text requires the reader to give meaning to it. Now, four, definitive reading is bound to fail. So you cannot have a definite readings, because every time you feel that the text means something, it is always saying multiple things. So meanings in literary text are never fixed and reliable, but always shifting, multifaceted, and ambiguous. There is so much of ambiguity, you never know what the text means, because every time you read it, you will find something entirely different. So the texts are sometimes, or rather all the time, they are self-contradictory, as we saw in deconstruction earlier. Okay, and literary texts, they are independent linguistic structures. Author is always dead, as we saw in Bards, the death of the author. Yeah. Then five, totalizing notions are held in distrust. Totalizing notions as in generalizing concept. There is no generic idea to something. You cannot say a teacher is supposed to be like that, a housewife is supposed to look like it. Well, a teacher very well may be a housewife as well, right? And a housewife may look far better put together than a teacher, or someone who's working for the for some company, right? You never know. There are no generalizing notions available, because yeah, there are no good books, and each is a product of some socio-political situation. So see, in my shelf I have a copy of Mein Kampf, even though I abhor Hitler to some extent. I mean, that abhorrence came from reading the very, the right to the copy of Mein Kampf is a copy of um, A Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank. Okay, so though both the books sit together, I have often wondered, is it subconsciously done, or it just seems to be there by chance? I don't know. Or deliberately put together. But somehow both the books end together. I cannot call, yes, so you cannot say that either book is bad or good, because each book seems to convey so much. Mein Kampf has so much of wisdom inside it, even though it is misleading, to a large extent, misleading in the sense it ultimately doomed millions and millions of people. It killed millions of people, right? Those ideologies killed millions of people. But the very basis of understanding the text would give you, an understanding of the text would give you a genuine vision, no genuine vision of bringing in a better world. Okay. So you see, there are no good books. Each one is a product of some socio-political situation, and the situation itself cannot be suppressed. The concept of human nature as a generalized form transcends the idea of a particular race, gender, or class. These norms are most often Eurocentric or androcentric, and is likely to marginalize or or even deny the humanity of women or disadvantaged groups. So human nature, the idea of human nature itself is a myth. So you cannot say something is simply natural. It's natural for a widow to seclude herself, cry, not care for her appearance, not be sociable. You cannot generalize human nature. You don't know what kind of interaction she had, what kind of relationship she had with her spouse, with her dead spouse, right? So you cannot generalize human nature. Each nature is going to be bound to be different, mainly because of its own individual experiences. Okay. Now, the summary of it all would be that politics is pervasive, language is constitutive, truth is provisional, meaning is contingent, human nature is myth. I request you all to please store this in your memory that politics is pervasive, language is constitutive, truth is provisional, meaning is contingent, and human nature is myth. So, we saw a little bit about structuralism, where it originated in France, and who the father of structuralism was, as in Saussure, and what the Swiss linguist. And so we saw his approach to language study and consequently his three pronouncements, how language is arbitrary and relational and constitutive, whereby we came to the understanding of another one of his distinctions on langue and parole, how language could be seen as language as a system of structure, and parole is seen as any given utterance in that language by a particular person or a particular individual utterance, right? And then we saw Claude Levi-Strauss' interpretation of myth. Please do remember each critic along with his one important work, at least. I mean, most of his important works, but yeah. So he applied Saussure's model of languages, which is found to be transferable to myth, to understanding the culture and or the stories of the Greek writers, of the classic writers. Especially, he applied it to Oedipus myth, and then we saw how structuralism moves from being particular to general, one particular text to the entire entire structure it belongs to. Then we understood certain works of literature or tribal rituals, fashions, trading cards, everything is understood in terms of these signifying systems. Then we saw Roland Barthes, who's known more for deconstruction and post-structuralism than structuralism, but then still you understand him necessarily because of his work as a literary critic and semiotician, and where he uses his mythologies to understand the culture of modern France, and he understood them in terms of differences in the significance of various practices of people during that time, during 1950s, and how each seems to work quite differently in the society. Some of the key writers, his key critics of structuralism, then structuralist critics, what do they do? So a list of things that the structuralist critics do, and then Barthian example is in Balzac and how he came up with 561 lexemes or units of meaning in 5 codes. Then we saw the 5 codes: proeretic code, hermeneutic code, cultural code, semic code, and the symbolic code, and how each seems to work in a narrative. Then using those codes, we see we see a proper structure. We try to devise certain patterns and certain parallels, draw some parallels in oval portrait. So we come up with certain understanding of the text, how one half seems to work with the other, how the one character seems to work with the other, and how certain dialogues seem to echo others, right? And also, like from the psychological perspective, how there is a certain power struggle going on between each pair, right? And also we saw a little bit about and we got an understanding of how the chateau itself, the setting itself, seems to work in different ways. It is paradoxical. For one, while it seems to be a haven for recuperation, for other it turns out to be a symmetry, or rather, where she finds her death. Then we see some further contrasts and basic dyads as in binary oppositions, so male, female, life, art, light, dark, looking, doing. So okay, fine. Then we saw applying the code of semic code to the text. We saw flickers of meaning as in implicit referencing, implicit as in something that is hidden, that is only hinted at, hinted references. Then close procedure. Please do remember these terminologies. Close procedure as in where words are deleted from the text and have readers fill in these gaps by drawing inferences so you get a better understanding of the text. Objective is to relay the text to a projected model of an underlying universal narrative structure. So what you get to understand is that every narrative has some universal context in which it works. Okay. Then so we did all of these exercises, and we saw hermeneutic code wherein we understand that for any narrative there has to be certain enigma that pushes the story forward, and the cultural code wherein you seem to have, or at least the text seem to have an understanding with your psychology where it tells you that you have a prior understanding of so and so thing or such and such person. So there is a generalizing tendency happening here. All right. So finally we come to post-structuralism and deconstruction. Some theoretical differences between structuralism and post-structuralism, how one seems to have been originated from the other, and we understand a little bit about the decentered universe we live in, and how this decentering has brought about a certain anxiety about language, and how we tend to reveal this anxiety in our day-to-day interaction. Then we saw some differences between both forms or both methods, approaches, in terms of origin, how they originated: structuralism through linguistics, post-structuralism through philosophy, and this Nietzsche's axiom, there are no facts, only interpretations. These are often repeated throughout post-structuralism because what we understand is that language, the unreliability of language is very much focused upon in post-structuralism. Then tone and style, how one is very much structured and very calm and scientific, the other is made to look very emotive and engaged and urgent and euphoric and flamboyant in style. Then in terms of attitude to language, while the structuralists are happy with the understanding that the world could be seen only through language, the post-structuralists go to the fundamentalist perspective wherein they realize that there is nothing outside language. So we see the aim of the structuralists is to question our way of structuring and categorizing, and also allowing us to restructure, okay, categorize. And the post-structuralists tend to rely on how I'm sorry, I was distracted in between. So I guess I'll stop somewhere here. So the individual, every individual is understood as a product of social and linguistic force, and there seems to be no essence in existence, only layers of textualities. So we saw Barth's movement from structuralism to post-structuralism through his work, Structuralist Analysis of Narrative and the Pleasure of the Text, and his pivotal work, The Death of the Author, which asserted the independence of literary text. Please do remember this. The Death of the Author asserted the independence of the literary text because this is the work that actually freed the text. So there is a certain freedom which is further understood not as a hedonistic abandonment but a restraint, or but a disciplined identification and dismantling of all of the sources of textual power through Barbara Johnson. Then we understood Derrida's Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, 1966. Please do remember this as well. And we understood it in terms of his of the various writers he talks about in Of Grammatology, and also how this work seems to have highlighted Nietzsche and Heidegger and Freud's philosophies and psychoanalysis in bringing about of the kind of world that is in existence which is so cut off from the previous or past thoughts. Okay, so this breaking away from our previous kind of thinking seems to have been brought about by certain historical events, some certain scientific discoveries and intellectual movements. Then we see Derrida's deconstructive reading would include speech and phenomena of grammatology and writing difference. And we saw so much about Derrida having written some 40 books, and each one seems to be a rebellion against the norms of the time, norms and dictates of the generalizing and totalizing norms and dictates of society. So, in of grammatology, yeah, we come across various terms: deconstruction, aporia, logocentrism, difference, lang, parole. Each seems to elucidate the point that language, the text itself, it has numerous contradictions, and there is always a deferral of meaning, a movement away from the signifier, giving you a network of signifiers, and thereby postponing meaning. And also you get to understand that you get some understanding of any text only through the differences. Okay, a sign is understood only because it is different from other signs. And we also understood how lang and parole worked. Some practical differences between structuralism and post-structuralism. We saw how the attitude of mind, structuralism seems to, all of it, both actually, seems to be attitude of mind rather than practical method of criticism. The main difference is that while structuralism looks for unity, though the text seems to be not so harmonious, the structuralists try to find some unity underneath, while the post-structuralism would imply that there is always some disunity underneath the apparent unity in the text. Then some definitions by Derrida and Barbara Johnson and all those people, and some practical differences. Try to remember this: structuralist and post-structuralist differences, and what the post-structuralist critic do. So they fix upon surface features of the word. They show that the text is characterized by disunity rather than unity. They look for shifts and breaks. Okay, they mainly look for shifts and breaks and focus on the textual subconscious rather than the overt meaning of the text. So we understood deconstruction in three stages: verbal, textual, and linguistic. While the verbal level would imply that you need to look into it very closely, as in, like, it's very much like the close reading, where you look at single paragraph or particular word and try to reverse the polarity of the common binary opposites and identify the paradoxes within, and see how there are internal contradictions between a word and another word in the same text, within the same text, and try to break it down, and understand it's not so unified state of being. Now the textual level, it goes takes a little further, this breaking down of words, and it mainly looks for shifts and breaks, the fault lines that are not so overt in the text. And these fault lines show how there are instabilities of attitude and lack of fixed and unified position. So there is no single wider context. You understand that there is no single wider context uh, to frame and contextualize this particular poem that we saw, the death of child, by drowning. Then at the linguistic level, we see for moments where the language seems inadequate, and because we find that every text seems to be saying something that is unsayable, right? And yeah, we look at the puns and allusions and all sorts of literary devices that are brought into play, and try to deconstruct the text through them. So the result ultimately is that the text reveals itself to be fractured, contradictory, and symptomatic of a cultural and linguistic malaise. We saw another example, Castaway by William Cowper, and the interpretation at various levels. Through this, we got an understanding of what aporia is, impasse, and the puzzlement, the entanglement in the text, the contradictions and paradoxes, all of it. Thank you. I hope you write your tests well. Yeah. And that is all for now. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.